celebration of life will begin. Just find your way to your seats quietly. Our first song this morning is going to be page 13 in the Pink Song book, We Gather Together.
This part with me, okay? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Please rise as you're willing and able.
Oh, yeah.
First Existentialist Congregation of Atlanta. We are a philosophically based spiritual organization dedicated to human liberation and founded upon existentialist philosophy and feminist principles. And we are also dedicated to the preservation of the natural world. We acknowledge that our home here, the spiritual home that we occupy, the old stone church was built by the Antioch East Baptist congregation, an African American congregation that lived in a thriving community in this neighborhood and was burned down under suspicious circumstances and then rebuilt by the congregation with stone from Stone Mountain. And then we also must acknowledge that this land we occupy, it once was occupied by the Muscovy Creek people, and that they were forcibly removed from this area by the government in the 1900s. We support justice for them and for all indigenous people. So, since today is close to Labor Day, I have a couple of readings about labor. I pity the man who wants a coat so cheap that the man or woman who produces it should starve in the process. Benjamin Harrison, a little-known president. It was the labor movement that helped secure so much of what we take for granted today. The 40-hour work week, the minimum wage, family leave, health insurance, Social Security, Medicare, retirement plans. The cornerstones of middle-class security all bear the Union label, John F. Kennedy. And the labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Martin Luther King Jr. So do we have any newcomers who are here for the first time or returning who would like to stand and let us know who you are and how you found out about us? I'm not seeing any unfamiliar faces, but do we have anyone who's returning after being away for a while who would like to be acknowledged? Very well then, it's a small and cozy group today. So are there any birthdays or anniversaries who would like to be recognized? Marty Keller.
Okay.
Would you like to be recognized?
Sure.
Okay. Let's sing.
It's my birthday next week.
Let's sing happy birthday to Marty.
Yesterday was my Aunt Dorothy Rodney Crowning's birthday. She would have been 108.
Oh my goodness.
She is the artist who gave me my start.
We remember them, her and Jan's brother. Okay, so let's have another congregational song. Please rise in body and spirit if you're willing and able.
Check
Jean.
out the pink book, page 63.
And let's recognize Jean Heinrich as our musician today. Great old Union song. There's a bit of sarcasm in it, as you probably noticed. It's a great fun song. Okay.
Lanier was a great believer in unions, and we have a number of songs actually in here that's of Lanier.
Right, Lanier, our founder, greatly supported unions. Yes, indeed. So now, I don't see any youth, so I don't think there's any youth programming downstairs, but we would have it if we had some youth. So now, if there are any community announcements, would you please write them down on a piece of paper and bring them up here anytime during the service, and I will read them at the end. Any community announcements? So, Is Marcia here?
She's out of town.
Okay, so we won't have Marcia Gutierrez giving her minister words today. So now then we have a time for silent meditation in which we can simply sit, meditate, cogitate, ruminate, or whatever we need to do. And there are candles on either side of the sanctuary that we may light in remembrance of those who have died, passed on. And so we'll take about 5 minutes for silent meditation, and I will ring the bell at the end of it. Thank you. We will now have another congregational song. So yes.
Page 9 in the pink book, Bread and Roses in honor of Marti's talk. Yes. And sing this with me.
favorite songs. Thank you, Jean. So now let's share some joys, sorrows, milestones.
May the wind deal kindly with us. May the fire remember our names. May springs flow, rain fall again. May the land grow green, and may it swallow our mistakes. Time is a wheel, always in motion, rolling, rolling along. Who wants to look back on their years and wonder where have they gone? I hope I'll never lose my sense of wonder. Get my fill, but always keep that hunger and not let the tragedies in life turn my heart bitter. And when I come close to selling out, reconsider. I don't wanna take the path of least resistance, or fear the mountain in the distance. I want to give faith in life a fighting chance. And when I get a choice to sit it out or dance, what are you going to do? I'm gonna dance. I'm gonna dance. I'm gonna dance. I hope you will with me. I'm gonna dance. I'm gonna dance while I'm still here. I hope you'll dance with me. Let's have good cheer while we're here. Let's dance.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, Jane?
I forgot some of the joys and sorrows, and I have to say it real quick. Beth Ann Buchanan, I don't know if you know her, she died last week. Her daughter Ruby Beth is the one who gave the scholarship to their first team. And I would like to see her and her baby, the baby got COVID. So I'm sure they'll be fine by Saturday. Next Saturday is the service at the Friends School at 4 o'clock.
Remembering,
They moved it again. I don't know where it's.
we remember Beth Ann Beacon. Thank you, Jane. And now, I'm going to introduce someone who you know already, but who does and will get an introduction. Reverend Marti Keller is the granddaughter of garment worker leader, union leader in Boston, at a time of sweatshops and dangerous working conditions. Her activist work has always been at the intersection of gender, economics, and racial inequalities. She headed up 2 advocacy organizations for women and children, worked in the arena of reproductive justice for Planned Parenthood, and for the UU Women's Federation. And she is a fashionista, early rising, haiku writing, UU minister who has a passion for women's rights and justice, and who, in the greatest of traditions, works in healing the world. May I introduce Marti Keller.
Thanks, Charlene. I love that, the early rising haiku thing. It's true. Many of you know that we have a puppy. How many of you don't know that we have a puppy? Yeah. Well, you are missing a lot of daily posts on Facebook. But the news from Teddy's quarter is he got through his neutering. He doesn't have to wear the cone of shame. So that's the big news in our family this week, and that's why Richard's not here, because he has to Teddy sit. Before I get into my actual remarks, I thought I would expose process a little bit. And process for me in writing is getting a bunch of clippings and sort of dumping them into a manila folder and sharing with you the things we see come up to cover Labor Day every year, the way that the media covers it. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in the Parade magazine, which is kind of a crappy magazine, every year they do something on what people earn, so I'll just share a couple of them. One of them I thought was interesting for 2 people here, and that is somebody here gets paid, let's see, to be a rare book archivist, $160,000 a year. I don't know if that fits with the I thought that was pretty astonishing. And a community doula, these are women that accompany women to childbirth and afterwards, and I've been thinking about that. $35,000 a year is what she makes. Yeah, it's really pretty wild. And then, one more. A virtual personal assistant, $22,000. But every year is really fascinating to see what's up and what's down in terms of employment. And then they usually cover what the new careers are, so I thought you might want to know. It's the rise of automation at work, so a lot of the jobs that are not being filled now weren't going to be filled anyway. They're going to be filled by automation. So food service, like I don't know if you've gone lately to any fast food places. I haven't gone since our 36-year-old son was about 10 years old. But I hear tell that mostly you order on an iPad, so you don't have to, God forbid, have any contact with the worker. Construction, all could be automated, including 3D concrete printing. Top industries in technology include healthcare, where we could, again, thanks to an artificial exoskeleton, get surgery without any surgeon actually touching us. So there you go. The news this year is no labor and a lot of technology. Does that make some sense to you? And then this is something that sort of fed my sermon on dangerous work. It's top 14 dirty jobs that need doing and people don't want to take. So I want you to guess with me which ones you might be willing to take. So it's the 14 jobs that need to get done that people don't want to take. The first one was gastroenterologist. Now why is that? Who else wants to have this? Anyway, you know what they do. So that one, even though they make a ton of money, like $300,000 a year, it's not a specialization that people want to go into. 700. Garbage collectors, that's kind of obvious. Oil rig workers, you can tell that. Portable toilet cleaners. I mean, have you ever thought about that? Who does that work? Coal miners, of course, crab fishermen, I hadn't really thought about that, morticians, and who make $60,000 a year or so, urine collectors. They have to collect farm urine from animals to create an effective hunting lure, so there's a whole industry in urine collection. And for some reason, it seemed a little weird, adult entertainers, not for the work they do, but it's just kind of an actual dirty business. There's a lot of opportunities to catch sexually transmitted diseases. So that's the news and labor land this year. Before we were any of those jobs appealing to you? They pay a lot of money. Well, I'm going to talk about my very first job, and I bet you for a lot of you women in the room, and maybe some of the men, this was also your first job. So guess what that was? Babysitting, right? Babysitting. Like many girls, my first paid job outside of the home, that was beyond my 50 cents a week allowance from my parents for backing me. Basically, I have 4 brothers, and I did all the household chores, and they occasionally remembered to like sweep the patio and mow the lawn. But that's what we got the 50 cents a week allowance for, was babysitting. And at 12 and 13, I had a very sizable clientele of families in the suburban area which I lived in, within a 15-minute bike ride of where we lived, and that was kind of my geographic spread. Now, some of my employers, I don't want to call them parents, employers, were great, with people who actually slept while I was there, and toddlers who didn't have tantrums, and refrigerators supplied with ice cream bars and soda that my mother didn't let us have. And I remember the Sunshines, and what a name for a family. I would go to Dr. Yeah.
Can you adjust the microphone more? Yes, thank you.
The Sunshines, Dr. Sunshine, he was a pediatrician at Stanford. They had more junk in their refrigerator than I'd ever seen in my life. And they paid me when I was finished working 75 cents, even $1 an hour. Other jobs involved babies with constant bowel movements, so that was kind of dirty work. Diaper rashes and colic, 4-year-old bullies, and picky eaters, and promises of tomorrow I'll get you what we owe you. But it was mostly okay work, and with the coins and bills I collected, I put them in an envelope in a drawer at my desk, and I saved them up for special extra things, like my very first pink transistor radio. The one I listened to when the Giants lost the baseball playoff series to the Dodgers, and I was heartbroken. And then there was my first mini skirt that I bought at the Stanford Shopping Center. I brought it home, and my mother said, "You have to take it back right now." Yeah. And then a Samoyed puppy that cost $75 and took months of babysitting earnings, much to my parents' horror when I brought her home. Since, of course, I hadn't figured on having to feed, inoculate, or spay her. Whatever I learned and whatever I saved and whatever I spent this money on did not in any way have to go for the basics in my life. Because I was fed and clothed and housed and even taken out for movies and hamburgers, with or without my wages. Work enhanced my sense of being responsible and capable. And you know, when you're 12 or 13 years old, how many can remember that? You're not feeling that a lot. You're feeling awkward and ugly and out of place. And so that babysitting money just got me right on track. It brought me metaphorically a feeling of independence at an age where you're feeling like you want independence, but you don't have it yet. It certainly filled up some otherwise dull and endless summers. It was short and good for what we like to call character development. I did not do it for the bread side of bread and roses. In other words, I did it for the roses. I did it for enrichment. I did it for my soul. And the transistor radio was just kind of an afterthought. I think it would have been fun just to make the money. I can't say the same for the first job I landed after graduating with honors in journalism from the University of California at Berkeley in 1970, the year of one of our periodic Great Recessions. And how many of you remember how bad it was in 1970? It was really bad. We didn't talk a lot in the last recession, but it was pretty nasty. When no one, it seemed, was hiring all these Berkeley grads for their diplomas, including me. Armed with my prestigious degree, I went to work for Swenson's Ice Cream Parlor, serving out single scoop and double scoops of cones filled with apple pie and pistachio and marble fudge and mocha ice cream. Sounds like a good job? No. After the first couple of days of enjoying the free taste we snuck when traffic was slow, I stopped craving ice cream altogether and did not regain my taste for it for many, many years. My arm ached and my hand burned from dipping down at the bottom of those big cartons. I tired of people barking their orders at me and then changing their minds about what flavor they wanted, or not having the right change and expecting me to make it up at the end of my shift. But then my husband, I was like 21 years old, and I needed the money that I brought in with no benefits, no holiday pay, certainly no sense of dignity, and really no way to stretch or bloom or any of those other valedictorian things they tell you was going to happen when you get your bloom up. I didn't last all that long as an ice cream scooper. I think it was like a paycheck and a half. Not even as long as my ex-husband, who had dropped out of college to find himself, lasted on the line in a Del Monte canning plant, or his next job working swing shift in the collections department of an upper-end department store. This period of genteel poverty was relatively short-lived, and truth is, while our parents wanted us to make our own way as a headstrong young couple, in fact, they didn't want us to get married at all, and when we got divorced 12 years later, I heard about it. They never would have let us go without electricity. They wouldn't, or ending up on the streets. We had a safety net in the form of economically stable, extended families who only let us dip down so far before they helped us back up for our sakes and certainly for the sake of the 2 small children that we had pretty soon after we got married. And we were embedded in a culture, a larger culture, where the assumption was that we would do better sooner or later. My young woman's dream of a better vocation, of bread and roses in my work and in my life was only a dream deferred. Longer, way longer than I would have wished. Not a dream that died, or no dreams at all. That was not so for my grandfather, and I would wager many of our parents and grandparents. A few years after the turn of the 20th century, my grandfather on my father's side escaped conscription in the Tsar's army, in Ukraine, by the way, as a teenager and made his own way in steerage to Boston, where he went to work doing what his father had done, what his grandfather had done, and how far back. There were some rebbies in there, but basically working class tailors was the line he came from, and did what his father had done. Son of a tailor, he found a job in a ladies' coat-making factory, where the hours were long, and the pay was ludicrous, and the conditions substandard. The same sort of conditions, I imagine, as existed in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York in 1911, when more than 100 shirtwaist workers, many of them young female immigrant workers, either died instantly or almost instantly in the fire that broke out on the 8th floor of the factory, or jumped to their deaths. Many of these workers were unable to escape because the doors had been locked to prevent them from stealing or taking unauthorized breaks. My father joined the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Go unions! In fact, was a very active organizer his whole life, even when he owned his own factory and I think got picketed once by the same union. I don't believe he expected intrinsic rewards for his hours of sewing and later supervising seamstresses. He wanted fair pay and safety. He wanted bread, in other words, and had no expectation of roses in his work. I know from reading some of his scribblings, translated a few years ago from Yiddish to English, that he had a gift for storytelling, but whenever he dreamed of a vocation in writing, whether he dreamed at all of possibilities within his work life, beyond sewing those ladies' coats and providing for his family, no one seems to know. So that was my grandfather's work story. I never learned my grandmother Fanny's story, or rather her work story, outside of the fact that she kept a kosher kitchen. What was reported to the Census Bureau in 1920 was that she was a housewife, not contributing to the household economy, like most, nearly all of the other women in that Boston tenement, where she raised her 3 children in a cramped 3rd floor. walk up. All I ever learned about my grandmother Fanny was that she was fat and she kept a kosher kitchen. A walk on the Brooklyn Bridge this past 4th of July weekend, ending in the Lower East Side of Manhattan at the Tenement Museum on Orchard Street and its preserved apartment building, showed me just how cramped and dark these rental quarters were for all the workers that came in. And it was the Jews, it was Italians, and Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. It's always been a place. It isn't a charity place. It's not free housing. These people have paid a lot of rent proportionally to live in these tenements. Showed me how cramped and dark these rental quarters were, and the guided tour, how off base the picture of what women's lives were really like in 1902, particularly the U.S. Census reports that documented them. The museum tour guide led us up narrow staircases with their faded wallpaper. Incidentally, the wallpaper was hand-painted. Some artisans really took it seriously that they wanted to make roses out of these tenements. And through the warren of rooms where one of the tenants, Jewish immigrant Jenny Levine, kept house, raised her children, and worked right alongside her husband to run a garment business, employing other immigrant women hunched over sewing machines day in and day out. There were sewing machines everywhere. There were sewing machines in the little parlor that wasn't any bigger than this section here, in the bedroom, in the kitchen. In the kitchen there was a sewing machine and a baby bed. These were tiny, tiny places. More than half of them took paid boarders into this crowded space, housing and feeding them, while others became house seamstresses and housekeepers and child minders for other women who had a lot more money. Incidentally, there's a saying about these tenements that most of the apartments held 10 people, and most of the toilets had 20 people in line at any given time. Other women in her building did the same, only instead of stitching clothes for far wealthier women, they worked in the many kosher butcher shops in the neighborhood. And it was they who formed the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association in 1902 to protest the soaring cost of kosher meat due to supplier inflation. These suppliers who they weren't immigrants themselves and they lived far away, kept raising the per pound price for the size of beef and stuff that they needed for the kosher meat. And at the time that it got just out of hand, it was like 18 cents a pound, which sounds like a lot to us now. But it really meant that they could not make their wages, and the people couldn't buy beef. And that was what was going on. Demanding that these shops be shut down until the wholesale prices were lowered, and throwing bricks through the storefront windows of those who would not go along. Getting arrested, 22 women at a time, going down the streets, throwing rocks and bricks in the windows of those businesses that refused to support their strike. One of the protesters told the press that, "I must help my husband who works so hard," and under her breath added, "We will overturn the world." Assumptions by the suppliers that these women were just ignorant and non-English speaking or understanding was emphatically false. And those thousands of women were successful in lowering the wholesale price of the meat that was so essential to 14 cents a pound. It's a huge victory. Thousands of women down the street making this happen. The phrase, the kosher meat strike of 1902, seeded future protests and larger scale strikes. These women modeled what was going to happen all over the world of labor for years to come. Their strike about beef, kosher beef, in 1902. The phrase "bread and roses" was first heard during a strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts during January to March in 1912. Earlier that same year, the Massachusetts legislature finally passed a law limiting the working hours of children under 18 to 54 hours a week. The huge textile corporations vehemently opposed the law and in act of retaliation cut the working hours and thus the wage of all their employees, adults and children, leading to a total workout of the people in the Lawrence factories, more than 35,000 of them in this relatively small Massachusetts town. This textile mill strike, which united dozens of immigrant communities under the Garment Makers Union, was led by a large extent, we are told, by women. Some have said that during the strike there were women who carried a sign that said, "We want bread, but we want roses too." This was a strike that appealed both for fair wages and dignified conditions, and beyond that, health care, educational opportunities, and cultural activities. The women who held up the sign "Bread and Roses" were saying that they weren't content, as writer Bruce Taylor describes them, with improvements just in the bare necessities of life and work. They wanted opportunities to enjoy their lives and family, to find beauty in the world, and to be treated with dignity and respect. Their demands were met over the years in that New England factory town as Lawrence opened free libraries, art galleries, concert halls, and parks. For these women, as for most workers who have given the time and opportunity to talk freely about what they wanted for themselves, would say that work should be a source of pride and joy and fulfillment, not all of the time, but more of the time that it often is. Not just working to live, but in some ways living to work, alive to their work. This is what they wanted even then, beyond the paycheck, beyond better working conditions. They wanted those roses. They wanted to live full lives. More than 30 years ago, radio commentator Studs Terkel created what became for him a micro-industry in published oral histories of men and women and their jobs. In Working, how many of you read that? It's pretty much a marker book, Working. A collection of people talking about what they would do all day and how they felt about what they did. He observed that Americans get up and go to work each day as much for daily meaning as their daily bread. That they were as likely to describe how little their work fed their spirits as to complain about how little they were paid. Not that a higher minimum wage and, more important, fair living wage wasn't crucial. It's just plain wrong. It's a violation of the golden rules of every living faith tradition, that even after working 2 or 3 jobs, you could still not earn enough money to make your ends meet or provide the basic subsistence needs of the family, the bread of life. This is a moral necessity, a moral necessity. The women who sewed clothing and worked in butcher stores and minded the children and kept house for the wealthy might be described as the essential workers of their time. We have heard that term, essential workers, since the beginning of the pandemic, often when describing how few workers are left and how many of them have suffered when they still work. While more privileged Americans with the luxury to stay home and work did so early on, and many of us are still working from home, low-wage workers, supermarket cashiers, delivery drivers, warehouse handlers, package deliverers, on and on and on, could not do that. Their stories have begun to be publicly shared. There have been some newspaper articles about these people, these essential workers, a lot about the medical workers, but about other workers who had to keep working in the midst of all this pain and suffering. The stories of the risk they've been forced to take, their health and their safety fears, the reality of the high infection rate in those populations versus the people that got to stay home and figure out how to use their computers and take care of the dogs and all the other things that you have to figure out when you work at home. Despite resulting varying, mostly incremental improvements in their working condition and benefits, in large numbers they have quit these jobs and closed so many businesses. I know you all know some businesses that are no longer open because they don't have the workers. These essential workers, most often women and people of color, have had enough. They didn't feel like they were even getting the bread part of the statement, let alone the roses. And then there were workers and jobs that remain even more visible. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. So we've talked about the essential workers. I'm going to talk about a population that is even more oppressed and even more invisible. Do you want to guess who they might be? Incarcerated folks and others. Immigrants in jobs. Writer Eyal Press, in his book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America, distinguishes between these low-paid, low-wage, underappreciated essential workers, those I talked about, who we see. You know, we hear about them, and nobody's going to say, we think they're doing bad things. We'll say that we think what they're doing is good. We might not be willing to step up and make it better for them, but they're respected. These are considered respectable jobs. Population of dirty workers, and I'm going to always do this, dirty workers, a term coined by Everett Hughes, who was a writer following a visit to Germany in 1948, so that was shortly after World War II, which led him to observe that the work of exterminating the Jews, or more obliquely solving the Jewish problem, which fell to people that ran the ovens and staffed the concentration camps and drove the trains that went to Auschwitz. The work of exterminating the Jews, or more obliquely solving the Jewish problem, was a category of dirty work where certain agents in society carried out this unethical, immoral, horrifying work with an unconscious mandate from society. An unconscious mandate from a society that wouldn't take the jobs themselves, and perhaps didn't want to talk about these jobs, but in some ways were glad somebody else was doing the job for them. Dirty work, what Eyal Press describes as work that many people see as morally compromised, unseen labor viewed in large part as necessary to our society, workers in prison psychiatric wards, workers in understaffed mental hospitals, workers who carry out our drone murders, because we really don't want to engage in full-scale wars anymore, so we do the drones, and workers on the killer floors of slaughterhouses. These are examples of these kind of dirty workers we don't talk about, we don't hear about, and probably we would say we don't approve of them, and we wonder why they have these jobs at all. Besides risks to their health and safety, these invisible workers, these dirty workers, he writes, carry the additional moral burden put on them, including stigma, self-reproach, corroded dignity, and shattered self-esteem. Periodically, these workers, like, for example, border control officers, might be considered dirty workers. I mean, what are they doing? They're rounding up people and sending them off, have been called out for their role in this very real suffering and harm that they have caused to the people and the animals in the slaughterhouse on the receiving end. He knows they aren't the victims at all. And you don't expect these people to understand that the people who are causing them so much pain, suffering, death are also victims. But they are. But pinning the blame for dirty work solely on the people asked to carry it out, we are told, is a useful way to obscure societal power dynamics and the layers of complicity that perpetuate their conduct. It can deflect our attention from the structural disadvantages that shape who ends up doing the work. We are reminded. The dirty work in America, this is no surprise, is not randomly distributed across the population. These jobs are taken disproportionately by high school graduates from depressed rural areas, undocumented immigrants, and people of color who lack the skills and the credentials and social mobility and power more educated people have access to. They do not feel that they have the option to walk away and find more desirable jobs. And union organizing, as you well know, in 2022, going on 2023, is not easy to do. It's not met with much success, even though there are successful efforts lately to unionize Starbucks. But your run-of-the-mill, major union organizing activity has no traction, and these people don't feel they have the personal traction to leave those jobs, not knowing what's going to happen to them in a small town where this is the only job available. If you know where the prisons are in this state and any state, they're in places, if they didn't have the prisons, there would be no jobs, or very few jobs. They are doubly burdened, experiencing economic vulnerability, while at the same time bearing the psychic toll of doing what Eyal Press calls morally treacherous work. He writes that behind the scenes in America is where the dirty work of our country unfolds, in the chambers and institutions such as prisons and industrial slaughterhouses, in isolated areas with high concentrations of poor people. So do you have any other, so I asked you once, can you think of other jobs that sort of fall in this category? So-called dirty work, besides the ones I think.
Executioners.
Executioners, executioners. That there was no response, there's no reflection on you, but it does prove the point that we don't think about them, we don't see them, we don't know what to do about them, but we mostly don't think about them. It is easy not to see it being this dirty work, talk about it, do anything about it. It's easier to remain passive about it, to feel hopeless as individuals to do anything about it. And that's the people in this population, I'm sure all of you included, who think there's anything wrong with this work at all, who might not want to do it, but don't want to see the prisons with no workers and the slaughterhouse with no workers and people, no executioners and things like that. The hope on this Labor Day, in the words of E.L. Press, is, as immutable as it may seem, he says, the dirty work in America is not foreordained. It is the product of specific decisions made by real people that could, in theory, be unmade. Policies that were enacted, laws that were put in place, decisions that were reached about how we do or don't conduct wars in the 21st century, or where we confine many of our vulnerable citizens, or whether they should be confined at all. These are policy and procedure and larger and larger questions than what happens with that individual worker. How we think about work, he says, reveals something about our society, our values, the social order we unconsciously mandate, and what we are willing to do, have done, in our name. Despite the fact we might not publicly say we support these things, there's a solid enough base of people that think these jobs are okay, that when a worker works, they are working in the name of all of us who remain silent. Work, the Persian poet Bill Brown wrote, is love made visible. Sister Joan Chister, social activist and Benedictine nun, tells us that meaning is clear. Work involves all of us in the exercise of world building and co-creation, and we must, each of us, in our own ways, find new ways to achieve it, with bread